Folks, Canadian Prepper here. So as you can appreciate, my inbox has been blowing up with people who are panicking about the possible invocation of Article 4, then 5, as a result of Poland absorbing a missile strike today from the Russians. At least that's the official narrative. What really happened? Was it a wayward strike? Was it an intentional strike? Could have been, because there are potential reasons why that we'll talk about why the Russians would want to directly send a message to the Poles. Was it a provocation on the part of the Ukrainians, false flag type thing, in order to bring the full force of NATO into the conflict before winter sets in? There's a lot of potential explanations. All I can do is give you my humble, meager layman's analysis on the situation. I am definitely not an expert, and I may well be wrong. All we can do is do a meta-analysis of what we know. What we do know is that the mainstream media is making a really big deal about this. So regardless of who's responsible, we know that it's already one of those nodal points on the graph, a nodal point of escalation. And that means that everybody freaks out as usual. You see, the thing with inevitable things, when you know that the clash between NATO and Russia is inevitable, is that it's inevitable. It's going to happen someday, but people are only going to get reactive and prepare for these things when there's these flashbulb events that hit the headlines. When times are calm, when it's easiest to prepare, people do nothing. And that was evidenced at the Tepsko, is that how you pronounce it? Tepsko grocery store today. There's a viral video circulating on TikTok, 6 million views or something like that. People fighting over recently discounted food. And it's ironic as we approach Black Friday that people are already fighting for food in what are relatively still good times, recessionary times, but relatively still good times. Now just imagine when the shizzy really does hit the fizzy, which it appears it's inevitable. Why is it inevitable? Because Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of Russia's National Security Council, has basically acknowledged, and now the Russians openly acknowledge, that the purpose of NATO is to destroy Russia. It's potentially to dissect the country into bite-sized pieces where multinational corporations can go in and exploit the resource wealth. That's what they think. Okay, I'm not saying that's what I think. That's what they think. And on the flip side of that, you have Zelensky's 10-point peace proposal, which basically precludes any negotiation. So in spite of all of the CIA meeting with Russia in Turkey, in spite of all of that has transpired, the so-called peace proposals that he's outlined are far more aggressive than they've ever been before. So we have an immovable object and a unstoppable force ready to collide. So it's inevitable. So prepare for World War III. I mean, anyways, I'm sick of beating that dead horse and beleaguering that point to death, but you kind of have to do it because it's bewildering to me. Anyways, so the Russians completely annihilated the Ukrainian electrical grid and supply lines today. 85 missile strikes, apparently out of 100, which might indicate that the Iranian missile defense, or I say Iranian, the Ukrainian missile defense has not been as successful as it's been in previous attacks. Although in previous attacks, they were using the Flying Doritos, the Iranian-inspired loitering munitions. Perhaps they're using better equipment now. So this has gutted Ukraine's supply lines and their electrical grid once again. Now, why is all this happening? There's a reason for all of this, and it's because what happened in Kherson, I've discovered now, or what my best guesstimates, based on listening to people who are far more intelligent than me and knowledgeable of the situation, is that they've now basically fixed the Ukrainians in place. That's a frozen conflict in the south. There's no way that the Ukrainians have the capability to cross the river in any meaningful way and stage some kind of offensive. The Russians are focused now on this place called Zaporozhye, where it's another oblast, which they've currently annexed it, but the Ukrainians control half of it. They control the city. The Russians control the nuclear power plant, which happens to be the largest nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Now, this is all related to this whole invocation of Article 4 and 5 thing, so just bear with me. Now, apparently, the Ukrainians are amassing a very large force, possibly 40,000 men, in order to come around. I don't have my map with me today, but it's basically where the river turns northwards, and the Ukrainians have a significant amount of force on the Russian side of the river already. And this is where they're going to try to come in and come under the river and basically encircle the Russians who are currently in Kherson, split the annexed territories in two, cut off Crimea, and that's the beginning of the end for the Russians in Ukraine if they are successful with that. So the Russians right now, they've been fortifying these positions. They've been fortifying that region for a long time. Of course, it's been subject of controversy because of the attacks on the nuclear power plant there. But they're preparing for this, and this is where they're going to fight. This is where the battle is going to take place. Now, if the Russians lose this, remember when I said that if the Russians lose Kherson, that's when the nukes and the EMPs are going to start flying. It occurs to me now that the strategy, they knew this battle for Zaporozhye was coming, so they're trying to relocate their forces to this region. So if the Russians lose this region, this is when they start utilizing the non-conventional weapons. And there isn't a doubt in my mind that that is exactly what's going to happen. And this is why the top spies from both the US and Russia recently met in Ankara, Turkey, just over the weekend to discuss de-escalatory practices, basically acknowledging that the risk of utilizing non-conventional weapons right now is incredibly high as a result of course, going into the winter, the Russians' grand offensive, which is supposed to, in theory, start towards the end of the year when the ground freezes, and of course, this final push by the Ukrainians into Zaporozhye. If they are successful, they go down to Melitopol, they cut off the two annexed territories, then that's when the shit really starts to hit the fan. Now, why does Poland matter here? Well, we still have this stuff going on the Belarusian border. Are the Belarusians going to come down, cut off with the Russian support there, and try to cut off the supply lines to Kiev? The real thing is that the Polish mercenaries apparently number in the thousands, okay? And they're going to be partaking in this Zaporozhye offensive. Now, maybe the Russians were sending a message. The Russian Defense Ministry denies up and down sending this missile into Polish territory. And they're not saying that it was a wayward missile. And a lot of people are saying, well, how it could be, because it would be, in the best of circumstances, a deviation of like 70 kilometers off its intended course, which may have been somewhere around Lviv, which is a western city where a lot of the weapons are flowing in to Ukraine from. So it's understandable why they would be targeting places within Lviv. But the idea, I guess, and I don't know ballistics and I don't understand, rocket trajectories and rocket science and all that stuff. So I don't know if it's even possible, but the experts are saying that it's very unlikely that a malfunctioning missile would deviate 70 kilometers from its path unless it was a malfunctioning hypersonic missile or something like that. We don't really know what it is yet. Regardless, it's killed 2 civilians in Poland. They're ready to invoke Article 4 and 5. They're calling, at least, I think, the last bit I heard was that they're calling for a convening of a national security meeting and potentially invoking Article 4, which of course will bring the consultation of all 29 countries to determine what the next course of action will be. This is something which is always going to happen in the run-up to the invocation of Article 5, which I'll read for you in a second just so you understand exactly what it means, which of course brings NATO into the conflict officially. And what they're calling for, apparently, I'm getting rumblings that they're potentially looking at or creating the justification for a no-fly zone around this region. Now, why would the Russians never go for a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine? Well, what this would mean is that if any missiles hit within this no-fly zone, which would be Lviv, where a lot of the weapons are coming into the country from, then that would be effectively a war on NATO. Okay, so it just expands NATO's sphere of influence out further, which is why I don't think the Russians would go for it. But right now we're realizing that red lines don't mean a whole lot. It's very ambiguous. It's far more loose in their interpretation than a lot of people think. A lot of these red lines, at least countries are not reacting to them immediately like many people presume they would. It's not just like, okay, you attack Poland, evoke Article 5 tomorrow, and then it's World War III. You know, there's a run up to these things. There's a progression. So, yeah, it's all related with respect to what's going on in the grand offensive, because this Zaporozhye could be the turning point of the conflict. If the Russians lose, then, you know, I mean, they really have no choice but to use a EMP weapon or a tactical nuke to send a message to try to freeze the conflict in that way. The thing is, and just to go on a sidebar here, why they wouldn't use a tactical nuke is because it's not particularly useful on a battlefield like this where the forces are so distributed and there's no real concentration of force. However, utilizing an EMP weapon, a powerful enough high-yield a high-yield nuclear detonation, which would completely fry every piece of equipment that the Ukrainians have, at least based on the experts I've spoken to. The power of some of these modern EMP weapons far exceeds anything that military equipment has been built for, like 3 to 4 times exceeds. So you're talking about crippling all military equipment over hundreds of square miles at a time per detonation. So that right there would stop every single tank in its tracks. That could be a card they play. Of course, when that happens, if you think the panic that we've seen today on just the rumblings that Article 4 might be introduced, just a wayward missile that went across the border, imagine what it's going to be like when that happens. Now, again, the Russians are denying that they did this intentionally, but bear in mind, with the Poles so deeply embedded in Ukraine, I would not put it past the Russians to be doing this to send a message. Of course, all it would have done now is triggered the NATO potentially coming into the conflict. Now, why is Poland on edge? I mean, Poland, we've been talking about how they're building bunkers, they're prepping their military. There's talk today that there's an article today in The Sun, of all places. I know it's The Sun. They're very, very pro-West, pro-NATO. And they pounce on any opportunity to propagandize and demonize the Russian mission, if you will. And I'm not saying I'm for that mission. I'm just saying that's the fact of that media platform. Is that apparently confidential documents leaked by German publication Der Spiegel, one of the country's top generals, ordered the country's army to be put on a war footing in the face of existential threats. So you have all these countries now preparing for war. England's preparing for war. And Poland is concerned, as the Baltic states are concerned, that the rest of NATO is either not going to come to their aid or is going to be incapable of coming to their aid because there's going to be civil disputes as to how much these countries want to commit. Or even if they do commit, in what capacity could they potentially commit in a conventional sense? Because Article 5, and I'm guilty of this as well, doesn't necessarily immediately mean nuclear war. I'll read it for you in a minute, but something people need to realize about when you're looking at, okay, you got 29 NATO countries, you know, if you include the US in there, I mean, if you take the US out, then the Russian military is superior to every single military in NATO combined if you take out the United States, like in terms of manpower, equipment, capabilities, definitely in a nuclear capability. It's not even a meaningful comparison. But one thing to keep in mind is that the way that a smaller country can go on an imperialist rampage is because even if you have this coalition of 29 countries, okay, they're not committing 100% of their military manpower and equipment to the collective fight. So you may have, like, let's take an easy example. The Russians have 100 tanks. Europe, these 29 NATO countries, have 100 tanks. When it comes to time for the Russians to do battle with NATO, the Russians are going to bring 100 tanks. NATO is probably going to bring about 50 tanks. Not because they have, their own military commitments in other countries, but because they're going to reserve their best equipment for their own individual needs and individual concerns. No matter how strong a coalition is, no country is going to commit the S word. I don't want to say it because the video will be demonetized, but nobody is going to put themselves out there like that just to, because your national security is number one, the top priority. But the second priority is, of course, the collective security. So you're going to have a situation where all of Europe is going to commit what it can, which isn't much right now at all, if anything, to this fight. What remains anyways, because they've sent so much and it's all been blowing up, a lot of it anyways. And you even have the Americans now talking about moving weapons from South Korea surplus. So it's not just the Russians who are supposedly running out of weapons. Anyways, it's not a one-to-one comparison, which is what I'm saying. So yeah, I just thought I would, go on a little rhetorical rant about that there. So we know that the media is paying a lot of attention to this now. We know that that means that this is likely a significant moment in the conflict. And regardless of and I think this coming on the heels of these talks between the spies in Ankara, Turkey, that signifies that this is potentially, we're really getting close to that big event that we've been talking about for so long. It just appears as though this is where it's heading, and I think we're going to look back on it as all these events unfold, and we're going to say, like, why didn't we prep more? Because it was so obvious. It's kind of just like the stock market bubble right now. I mean, everybody's like, yeah, it was so obvious, that the stocks are down 50% this year, and some of them anyways, like the big stocks, the big FANG stocks, and just like the other indices down so much. People are now, in hindsight, saying how obvious it was. But even right now, even with everything I know, there's still doubt about the situation. So I think I covered pretty much everything. Russia denying that they had any involvement in this is pretty substantial, because they could have just admitted that it was a wayward missile, and this likely wouldn't have went anywhere. If the Russians just admitted that this was an accident, and even a senator said this today, that the Russians probably made a mistake and that they just need to own up to it, and then this will likely diffuse the situation. That the Russians aren't doing this tells you that maybe there is some sort of provocation going on, because Poland is concerned that the war is going to spill onto their borders. Obviously, they're housing millions of refugees right now. Their economy is in shambles. I don't even know how their economy is staying afloat. So they're very concerned. They're wanting reparations from Germany and all this stuff. And, funny thing in Germany, as they are now trying to do an overhaul of their military, funny thing happened the other day. Germany accidentally issued uniforms for its soldiers with SS labels. The initials are believed to have stood for small short, with a production problem blamed on the mistake. Anyways, just weird stuff is happening, weird parallels. But Germany is committing 100 billion to overhauling their military, the Bundeswehr. I'm probably not Bundeswehr. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Anyways, they're buying a bunch of equipment, but like I said, I don't think they're going to stand a chance in a conventional war versus the Russians unless the United States really gets involved. And apparently the United States has its hands full with what's going on in Asia right now. Now, recall, yesterday I told you guys I talked about the parallels between, Biden using the exact same verbiage that he used when he talked with Putin in 2021, at the meeting in Geneva and saying the exact same thing about his conversation that he had with Xi Jinping yesterday. And then just today, a major military exercise has begun between Japan, South Korea, and the USA involving 35,000 troops. So all of that 3-hour talk was just fluff. Okay, the war in Asia is coming as well. And let's just read Article 5. So going back to that, just so we kind of know exactly what we're talking about here, when, you know, because there's a lot of talk that Article 5 is going to be the defining moment of this conflict where it officially becomes World War III. But let's just read what it has to say. The parties, and this is going to be very legalese for both, the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic Treaty area, I should say. But just notice the wording in there, such actions as it deems necessary. This is not a hard and fast rule. This doesn't mean that everybody jumps into the fight with everything that they have right away. This doesn't mean we just start firing nukes at Moscow. This just means that other countries enter the war in some coalitional capacity at that point. Any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. Such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. So right there, too, you know, to what degree Article 5 isn't just Article 5 until Russia is destroyed. It's Article 5 until whatever caused the invocation to emerge has been dealt with and subsides. Now, this is how it would start. I mean, this is how you would expect it would start. A wayward missile, or maybe an intentional attack intended to send a message to Poland to test the waters, perhaps. We know that the Russians are amassing a huge amount of troops in Ukraine. They're prepared to hold this territory. And any time that the Russians have been engaged with the Ukrainians and have not withdrawn, they've held the territory for the most part. I mean, they've had some smaller territorial losses that were the result of, actually being outgunned. But the thousands of square kilometers, anytime they've lost a meaningful amount of land, it's because they've withdrawn their forces. Because recall, it's all about preserving force. It's not about taking land. Once the military is destroyed and the government has been decapitated, the land is yours. It's all about how many guys can you destroy. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that missile fragments shown by Polish media had nothing to do with Russian weapons, they claim. No missile strikes were carried out against any targets near the Polish-Ukrainian border, and any reports saying otherwise are a deliberate provocation in order to escalate the situation. My God, what a exciting state of affairs in a very bad way. That's pretty much the news for today. Let's see what happens. Let me know what you guys think is transpiring there. And all we can do right now is continue doing what you're doing. Your preparedness efforts won't be in vain. And it's unfortunate that it's these type of flashbulb events that really prompt a preparedness response in a lot of people. It's the only thing that elicits that response in people. But I guess that's just the nature of things, is that people are not going to, the majority of people aren't going to react until it's too late. And I think the writing is on the wall. I think we're going to see oil go up significantly after December 5th, after the imposition of this Russian oil price cap. Everything is taking shape. It looks like there is going to be a Russian offensive. There is going to be a big battle in Zaporozhye. There likely will be the use of non-conventional weapons because neither side is making any sort of concessions. And it's not as though the lack of concessions, the gap there has been decreasing. It's only expanding. Okay, the demands of Zelensky have expanded. And of course, the demands of Russia and what their plans are have arguably expanded. I mean, they've wanted to take Odessa. They now pretty much, I think, have acknowledged that they're going to need to take the entire country. And you have the amassing of troops on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. That's still a thing. So I think right now it's safe to say that the worst that can happen is the most likely scenario. I mean, it really is the most likely scenario. That doesn't mean it's going to escalate to a global nuclear war, but at least in the theater of Ukraine, the worst is going to happen. I mean, there is no, I mean, you'd be very naive or ignorant to think otherwise. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.